Are newt species hiding inside of living species? Hi, my name's Joel Duff, and that's the question we're going to be asking ourselves today in this continuing series on exploring creationism. What does it mean that a species could be living or hiding inside of another species? Well, this is the response of one young Earth creationist, Kurt Wise, to the general question, where does biological diversity come from? Where does the incredible abundance of diverse life come from? We're going to explore that question coming up. All right, the way we're going to address this big question of the origins of biological diversity that we see today, we're going to just read a short article by Kurt Wise, published in the New Creation blog, which is sponsored by Is Genesis History. And that article is entitled Glorifying God, the Hidden Diversity of Created Kinds. Now, let me introduce you quickly to the author of this particular article, and it's Dr. Kurt Wise. Kurt Wise has a bachelor's in geology. He then went on to do a master's and eventually a PhD at Harvard in invertebrate paleontology with the very famous paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. And so he has excellent credentials in terms of his training in paleontology. And what he's doing is in this picture here, he's made a video series for a homeschool biology textbook, which I'll show you in just a moment. And he's currently the director of Truett McConnell University's Creation Research Center. All right, he's a young Earth creationist, and as a young Earth creationist, he's not part of one of the three major apologetics ministries, like Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, Institutes for Creation Research. He is what I would call sort of academic young Earth creationists that work in sort of the academic arena. I like Kurt Wise personally. I've seen him talk and in person, and I really enjoy his style of delivery, and I find him to be one of the more provocative young Earth creationists. Provocative meaning that when I read his material, I always find that he says something new. You know, he has some new twist, some new way of looking at things that the other young Earth creationists haven't said or been willing to consider before. He's a little bit avant-garde in terms of the young Earth creationist world. This is part of being an independent researcher, kind of allows him to do. He's not sort of under the thumb or of a ministry where there's certain, I'll say, guardrails in terms of what ideas and things you can explore. So he's freewheeling and he's willing to put ideas out there. And I think many of them are very wrong as many other young Earth creationists are. But I appreciate his willingness to sort of needle and ask really hard questions of other young Earth creationists. And he is attempting to provide answers for those things. So what we're going to look at is one of his answers, all right, in sort of a simple format for a high school biology student who has the question, where in the world did all this diversity come from? Why are there so many different species? How could there be so many species? Did God create every single one of these species? Or did he create something that was a common ancestor to many of those species that are alive today? And exactly how would that work? How would we get to the point where there's many species today? All right, he's addressing that question in this particular article. So let's take a read through. All right. And so before I get started, here's his recent book, Devotional Biology, Learning to Worship the Creator of Organisms. And as I said before, this book actually is a book written to go along with a video series that would be a series of videos that you would purchase and show for homeschooling sort of science class on biology. And this article that I'm reading is just taken right out of this particular book and then republished is Genesis History. All right, let's kick it off. The commands Be fruitful and multiply, from Genesis 1, 22, 28, and so forth. Bring forth abundantly and multiply, multiply, and breed abundantly. Right? We read these words multiple times in the opening chapters of Genesis. Could conceivably refer to the process of increasing numbers by the process of reproduction. And in starting out with this particular sentence, I think he's capturing a common sentiment among Christians as they read the text and after the flood, and then the command given to Adam and Eve to go out, be fruitful and multiply, right? Have many offspring, fill this world that I've created, right? I've created this world and it's not completely populated yet or completely been I don't want to use the word subdue, been appropriately managed, all right? And fill that world. And usually I think that what that conjures up in most Christians' minds is just have lots of offspring, right? Reproduce your own kind after itself. And that would be true for all the other animals and other organisms. They're also given that command to fill the earth. However, he says, the variety of phrases employed in the text suggests more than one process is actually involved. Right? There are multiple different Hebrew words used for this multiplication process. It is likely that at least one of those other processes is diversification, an increase in species diversity. So right from the get-go, he's going to say that the Bible has actually given a command to the life that he has created. All right, God has created living things, and we'll get to what exactly is the state of those living things in a moment. But he's created living things on this earth and given them the command to abundantly multiply or be fruitful and multiply. And that doesn't mean make more copies of yourself. But as you make copies of yourself, as he's going to say, no, he's not exactly going to say that. As you reproduce and encounter different environments, the way to fill the earth and be fruitful in this earth is to fill the different biological niches, all right, the different environments of the world. And to do so, one needs to adapt, right? Organisms need to change and adapt to fit their properties best to those environments so they can be fruitful in those environments. And that's going to involve some kind of process of diversification, some kind of increase in species diversity. Let's stop for a moment just really quickly and get some sense for what a species is. We're going to use a really simplified understanding of species. We'll just say those are groups of organisms that have very similar morphological or superficial features, right? Things that we identify and say look very similar to one another, and they can easily breed and have offspring themselves, right? So other groups of organisms, so zebras versus horses. Zebras look very similar to each other, and they also breed with each other quite readily. And they don't as easily breed with horses. It is possible to breed a horse with a zebra, but it doesn't happen in nature very frequently, if at all. And therefore, they remain separate groups of populations that are propagating themselves and filling different niches in the environment. So that's a way of thinking of those are different sort of units of life, different diversity units, okay, different species. Okay, so he's saying there must be some process in which diversification happens. The original created life must diversify and fill this world, and that must include processes that actually create new species, increase the diversity of species on this earth. All right, so there's our problem, right? He's setting out he's setting out what must be a truth in his mind, right? That here's the command that life has been given, and here's the response. And the response is to fill the world, and we see lots of diversity. Therefore, speciation must happen. Right? Each kind, and in parentheses there, Baraman, The word mean is the Hebrew word that has been translated kind, which you can have many discussions about exactly what a kind is, but that word is translated as kind for us. And bara is the Hebrew word for create, and so a created kind. And this is not a word that's in the Bible. This is simply a young Earth creationist a way of defining what a kind is. It's a created thing, all right? It's a created kind. Sort of a unit of creation, I guess you could say. God created these things, and they're called kinds. Of land animals, so we're just going to be talking about land animals, and there's a reason for that. It's because of the flood only dealing with land animals, was represented on the ark by 2 individuals, or 14 in the case of clean animals. If a species is defined as a breeding population, and that's kind of what I just called it, each unclean animal baraman at the end of the flood would have contained only a single species, right? The flood wiped out only 2 of each kind were brought on the ark. So 1 species, a male and a female from that species, was brought on the ark. No matter how many different species existed prior to the flood. So there's the original created kind, which then might have diversified, and he's not going to deal with that in this paper, but it might have diversified into a number of different species, right? Because be fruitful and multiply, right? That was the command given to the animals and to Adam and Eve prior to the flood. And so the expectation is they would have diversified and multiplied into multiple different species prior to the flood. However, the flood wiped out all the species except for a pair of the uncleaned kinds. And therefore, I think his logic is sound here. There would have only been 1 species on the ark. Now, there is, you see this note here. The note at the end is that he holds out the possibility that the male could have been from 1 species and the female could have been from another. All right, so there was lions and leopards before the flood as 2 kinds of cat. 2 species of a single kind of cat. And those 2 species then maybe had a female leopard and you had a male lion, and they were brought on the ark to represent the kind. So you could have had 2 species on the ark, but those 2 species are still in the same kind. But let us not get too far astream from the main point here. In the case of clean animals, there could have been as many 7 species if there were 7 pairs of each pair bred separately from all other pairs. So there could have been 7 species. In the present, however, most baramans contain many species. Some even contain thousands of species. Now, I'm not sure what baraman he's referring to that contains thousands of species. If he's talking about land animals, I mean, sure, some kinds of insects or so forth might have thousands of species within a family or a kind that young Earth creationists call them. The finches is one of the largest families that I can think of land animals, and they have about 1,500 different species. But you can see that the problem he's raising here, and he is actually asking a question that is one that he knows that young Earth creationists need an answer for, and he's going to attempt to provide it, which is the whole reason we're talking about this right now. But the problem he's bringing out is there are potentially thousands of species in some kinds, but there could have been only 1 of those species on the ark, or maybe 7. All right, maybe 7 species, but not thousands. And there are thousands today, and the ark only happened 4,350 years ago. And so between 4,350 years ago and today, God gave the command to Noah after leaving the ark to be fruitful and multiply, and presumably that's for all living things. And what has happened? They've been fruitful and multiplied and made thousands of species. Now, the interesting question, of course, is how did they do it? Right? And do we have evidence for that? Following the flood, there must have been a substantial increase in species diversity, yes, within baramans, right? Which he calls intrabarometric diversification, right? Just means within baramans, within the created kind, there must have been massive diversification into this new world that appears after the flood. It is likely that highly specialized species that show up late in the fossil record are species that developed late in this process of diversification. All right, I'm right here. Now, this is where I'm going to stop and say this is the first place where I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't understand his use of this. Well, actually, I understand what he's doing, but I would say that he's not accurately portraying the fossil record here. What does he mean that it's highly likely that species that show up late in the file, highly specialized species that show up late in the fossil record, developed late in the process of diversification? So now let's do a little drawing over here. All right, we've got the flood. All right. Now, before the flood, you had, say, the original created kind, and maybe it diversified into a bunch of lineages, which we'll go ahead and call species. And each one of these lineages had maybe thousands of individuals in populations. But at the flood, all those were killed, and they're in the fossil record. All right, so now he's talking about the fossil record here, but this is a different fossil record right here. This fossil record he's talking about here is not the same as the flood fossil record. Right, so if we were to say, there's a whole bunch of rocks here. They were all laid down by the flood. And all these things that were alive before the flood are sort of scattered around in here, found in, they're all jumbled up in the flood fossil record. Well, then there is some point where the flood ends, right? So we got to have an ending to the flood. Then after the flood, what's there? I mean, there's an ark, right? And on this ark is a door, and out walks what? Out walks two, right, individuals representing what was all this diversity, right? So those two individuals here. And so you have these two individuals, and they begin, right, a new lineage, right? They are like the origin point of this kind again. They get a restart. It's the same as with human beings, right? I mean, in the young earth creationist interpretation of Genesis 7 through 9, God is wiping out all human beings to start over with Noah and his family. So it's a restart of history to see if maybe things will work out better this second time. Of course, we know they don't because they fall into the same pattern of sin and so forth. But you translate that over to, well, the same thing are happening to the animals if it's this global flood. The animals are also, the diversity of life of all the other land animals is depleted, and you're back to two individuals. We're just sticking with the story of two and not the sevens. All right, gotta find my marker here. All right, so you have these two individuals, and then what happens to them? They begin to multiply, right? And as they multiply, though, there are post-flood events, right? The world is still a kind of a chaotic place. There's still floods, there's still local floods, and there's earthquakes, and there's all kinds of things happening, right? There's deposition of sediments. And what's happening is there's still layers of sediment being laid down after the flood, right? So these are all post-flood rocks. And you can get in lots of debates about what's post-flood rock and what's not post-flood rock, but I know what Kurt Wise's view is, and that is that there's a lot of post-flood rock. And what he's saying right here, just to really flesh this out here, what he's saying here is late in the fossil record are species that developed late in the process of diversification. Late. What he's talking about here is he's saying you add some individual members here and they diversified, right? They started to copy themselves, and then some of them became fossils, and then they diversified more into other species. And these became other species, all right? And they're all branching off into different species as they begin to migrate out across the world. Think of an original cat, two cats, and then they begin to migrate into the different continents, and there they begin to diversify into all the different species of cats that are alive today, plus all the extinct species, so like 100 different species. And as they do so, some fall prey to different natural disasters, right? Fossils can form under non-global conditions. And Kurt Wise is saying that, right? He's saying there's lots of fossils in the fossil record of different cats. And what we see is there's some sort of basic type of cat originally, right after the flood. And that basic type of cat turns into the large cats. And then you have your smaller cats. And And you got your lions and your leopards and your pumas, and your catamounts and your domestic, your African sand cat and so forth, right? So you have all these different kinds of cats. And as you move up the fossil record, which represents more and more and more and more recent, but don't forget, we're only talking about 4,000 years. All right. So as you move from 4,000 years ago up to the present, and you see different fossils in those rocks, he's saying that they become more highly specialized. Now, if he wants to define that as more specialized, that's fine. But I would say that there are lots of really specialized organisms, like in the original fossil record of the flood. And there are plenty of super duper specialized organisms that are right at that boundary and just above it that he thinks is the boundary of the flood record. I don't think of the fossil record as becoming that much more specialized just in the very, very top layers of the fossil record. But I'm kind of doing this to give you what's the pattern here. What's he talking about? And as a paleontologist, of course, he's interested in fossils. And so he thinks he sees this pattern of post-flood diversification in the rock record. And he thinks there's a lot of rocks. And again, as I said, a lot of creationists disagree with this. All right, so now he says, look, there's 2 species mentioned in the Bible as existing within just a few centuries after the flood. And so he says, look, if you go to Job, which most creationists believe is a very, very early record of what happened right after the flood. So one of the earliest books of the Bible, despite where you'd find it in your traditional canon, right, where it's located in your Bible. And then in Genesis 12, right, just a few chapters after the flood, there's mentions of camels. Right, so that for him suggests that the command to multiply and was fulfilled very rapidly. All right, so there must have been extreme rates of diversification because now you have very specialized, specific types of cats and a specific type of dromedary, and they are very similar, if not the same, as what we see today. So if a lion is part of a larger group, the feline group or kind, and all the other felines, all 100 other species, came from just 2 that walked down the plank off of the ark, but now you have lions and they're already present, like mentioned, right, in Job, which is only a few hundred years after the flood. So they have gone from some generic cat to this very, what he would call is a very specialized lion, right? It's completely adapted to a particular environment. And interestingly, that environment, may have never existed before, right? Before the flood, that type of savanna environment in Africa, along with the types of animals that were prey, is unlikely to have existed prior to the flood in most conceptions or perceptions of what the pre-flood world was like. And so, therefore, these lions had to have changed into lions from this other generic cat ancestor in just a few hundred years, which would just be, 15 to 50 generations, right? Let's say 50 generations, 50 replicative processes, all right? Would have to suddenly become these different species. And that brings us back to the original article title, right? Where is this variation? Where is it hidden in those 2 individuals that were on the ark? And he thinks it's hidden variation that suddenly comes out, right? So one species literally has many, many other species hiding inside of them that then are suddenly sort of sprung upon the world through the process of, let's hold off on the process. All right, that's where it gets pretty interesting. I got to keep you hanging around, right? Okay, this suggests the command to multiply and fulfill was very rapid. Human breeders, now he's going to go do a little comparison. This is actually kind of like what Darwin does in The Origin of Species. He compares a lot of things to human breeders and what we can see happens in breeding process. Human breeders are continually active in working with species that already exist in order to develop new varieties, cultivars, and breeds. All right, we've made lots of different horse breeds. Look at all the different dog breeds we have. And we know, I think everybody accepts that all the dog breeds are just a subset of the wolf species. Not even just canines, right? There's 36 different species of living canines, but all domesticated dogs are just one subset of one of those species, the wolf, Canis lupus, or even new species, as in the case of thousands of orchid species. I don't think he's right about that. Okay. I mean, the way this sentence is written, it sounds like human breeders have made thousands of orchid species. I would say they've made thousands of new varieties, all right, cultivars of orchids. But I wouldn't say that we've made new species of orchids, right? So just like we've made breeds of horses and dogs. Many of the new forms are developed by artificial selection. True. Choosing young with desirable forms of a particular characteristic and breeding them generation after generation to inherit that characteristic. Yes, that's what artificial selection is. Artificial selection is, the reason it's artificial is partly because we're doing it. We're consciously sort of designing or choosing, right? I choose these traits, as opposed to nature choosing. And I don't mean nature in some sort of metaphysical way. I mean nature as in all the way the organisms interact in their environment. The environment then selects the characteristics of particular individuals that are best fit for that environment. And because they are better fit for the environment, they're more likely to have offspring, which then share those characteristics with the next generation, making the next generations more similar. Well, what makes that different than artificial selection, where we're looking at, you can call us the environment, right? We're selecting for a particular trait we like and moving it to the next generation. The thing about artificial selection is we rarely select for overall fitness of an organism. We're not selecting for the most fit organism. We're selecting for a particular characteristic. I want spots on my dog, right? And so I'm going to make this Dalmatian. Nature doesn't make Dalmatians, right? In the sense of the Dalmatian dog, they're not well adapted to the environment. They're well adapted to us, but we make them that way. All right, so artificial selection is a little bit different, but nonetheless, it gives you the idea that he's trying to use here, is that we can take you take something like a wolf and look what we can do. We can make a whole bunch of different domesticated dogs out of it, and look at these dogs. These dogs are really different looking from one another. And so maybe that's the way all organisms have come about, right? God created some generic version of this kind that could then be, the nature could pull apart into little, maybe God created different kinds, and those kinds then had all these, basically had all this stuff inside of them that could be pulled apart into the different species that we have today. It sounds, when you compare it to breeding, this is a very attractive hypothesis, I'll put it that way, for young Earth creationists. And I would think it was very, very appealing to those who don't know a lot about biology and genetics. They'll say like, oh yeah, look, you can take a wolf and you can turn it into lots of different varieties of dogs, which look as different from each other than any other dog kinds do. And so why couldn't you just say that was what happened after the flood? You had two individuals, and then after they reproduced, they began to spit out all different variations, which then the environment quickly selected and said, look, we've got all these different species now. And that's where all the species come from. Right, so it seems very attractive, this last sentence. Many of the remaining forms were developed by crossing different breeds, varieties, cultivars, or species to create a unique combination of characteristics. Yes, we do cross different cultivars. I have a golden doodle, right? That's a cross between two different breeds, right, of domesticated dogs, to create something that's a different combination than others. And we combine even different species at times in order to get different characteristics we want in those owners. So it seems like life is kind of pliable. You can quickly manipulate it into different forms. And so he's going to use this manipulability, all right, malleability, I guess you could say, and say that this is how organisms could have been changed into the many different diverse forms of life we have in front of us. So artificial selection reveals characteristics that were already there, but hidden. Right? And like look at a wolf. Oh, look, now I've got completely different, what appear to be completely different characteristics in domesticated dogs. So they seem to have been hidden in the wolf, because I don't see the wolf with like these short snouts, and I don't see a wolf with long hanging out tongues, and I don't see wolves with curly tails, and I don't see wolves with floppy ears, and I don't see wolves with spots, and I don't see wolves. You can just keep going down a list of like characteristics that domesticated dogs have, and you say to yourself, but wait a second, all those different characteristics came from a wolf ancestor, and so their descendants have these other characteristics. So what does he conclude from this? They must have been hidden, right? Those characteristics are in wolves, but they're hidden there, unseen. And then continuing, crossing combines revealed characteristics in new ways. I guess after the original two animals had offspring, then you could say that those offspring could cross back with each other, and then they could reveal new combinations. In each case, humans did not create something entirely new, but merely revealed more of the variety already present in these organisms. So he's saying human beings, we said I like that particular characteristic, and we artificially chose it, and we eventually made Dalmatians and pugs and what Great Danes, right? But we didn't actually make anything new. We merely revealed the variety that was already there in the wolves. Now, I would actually take issue with this. I don't want to go too far down this tangent because there's other things we need to get to, but I'll just say that this isn't not a completely accurate picture of what happens with any of these different kinds of artificial selection scenarios. Yes, you could say the variants were there, but what we're doing is we're pulling out particular variants and combining it with things that wouldn't normally survive in the real world, right? And so they're there, but in new combinations. But I'll also say this, floppy ears, different developmental patterns, right? Those are things that we're choosing different developmental variants in the genes. But also things like floppy ears, and there's a whole bunch of other traits, are actually mutations that we have selected for. And they're mutations that weren't all found in the original wolves. There are mutations that have occurred after that process. And so we're selecting new variants that create new properties. So domesticated dogs do have new characteristics not found in wolves. And so that is a continuation of the origination of new variation, and therefore new form things. So it's not simply expressing something that was hidden before. It simply didn't exist, and now those characteristics have come into existence. This is why such forms can be generated so quickly. It is likely that this revealed variety is a small sample of the hidden variety God has placed in organisms at the time of the creation. All right, so he thinks that even this variety that we're seeing as we pull out domesticated dogs from dogs, or make all these different orchid species, is just a small sample of the hidden variety God has placed in all organisms. So God has placed a whole bunch of variants apparently into organisms, or even programs, right? Genetic programs that say, here's things you can turn off and on in order to create different characteristics. Maybe there are things that haven't been turned on yet, right? Haven't been expressed, have never been combined in certain ways. And so therefore, those particular traits have never revealed themselves or expressed themselves as physically manifested themselves. And all this was done at the time of creation. So way back at the time of creation, that God put all these different variants, like everything you see in this kind and all the different thousands of species that we might see today, all have to have been found in the original kind. And and they're simply being exposed over time. That's why I said in my title, my talk, are new species hiding inside of previous species? And that's essentially what he's saying. That even today's species may be hiding other species inside of them. The information, right? The programming, the variants are already there, and someday they may be exposed and become new species. Some of that variety was placed there so humans could glorify God by revealing more diversity. All right. I mean, he's saying that God put that diversity there so that we could, as we learned how to do artificial selection, we could find new things that God had placed there, right? There's little treats out there for us to find and explore. And so as we learn more, we're actually pulling out more diversity that was already there. But most of the variety was probably placed there so as to maintain the diversity that God created to illustrate his plurality. Why is most of the diversity there? Most of the diversity is there because God needed, to maintain the diversity of life, right? And to continue to express his creativity, right? It continues to be expressed because life is constantly unfolding, right? Life is constantly it's expressing itself in new ways. Again, all of this is saying that it was all present and sort of prepackaged in the original creation. Because God isn't creating anything new, right? There isn't any new creation. It's all just pre-programmed, original, foreknowledge. I know what God knows what was going to come, and so he put some variant in the original created kind that 10,000 years later could be turned on or used in some way that had never been used that way before, but would be appropriate for that particular environment. All right. So I think you can kind of see where we're going with this, but since at the time of the creation, God knew that diversity would be decimated at the time of the flood, right? God knew that this flood was coming. He had created these kinds, given them the command to be fruitful and multiply, but knew that that Adam's sin and the growing sin in the world, filling the world, would need to be taken care of, and he was going to do it in this particular way with a global flood. He knew that there was going to be a need for diversity of organisms to fill that future world. And so he hid enough diversity within organisms to restore the diversity following the flood. Now, I'm not going to go into the genetic bottleneck thing and how would that diversity squeeze through. Let's just say that there's a mechanism somehow where the diversity that God had created and hidden in the original kinds had then multiplied and diversified before the flood. But then when God chose, because remember, God told Noah that he would bring the animals to the ark. We're going to say that God brought a specific pair of organisms that still had all those variants inside of them that they weren't using, right? Because we're talking about hidden variation. We're talking about all kinds of characteristics and capabilities of organisms that are hiding inside of the organisms that were on the ark. And then after they got off the ark and they experienced these new environments, they found those variants useful for how they would adapt to that new world. And a variety of different creationists have different ideas about how this would happen. He hid enough diversity within organisms to restore the diversity following the flood. And since God did not want even one person to miss the message, God also created a process capable of quickly expressing that diversity in the course of the first human generation following the flood. The first human generation following the flood. He's saying that within that first human generation, which remember could be a fairly long time, hundreds of years, you had all the other kinds exploding in terms of their diversity. Every time they're making, having offspring, those offspring are potentially new species. One species giving rise to another species, and they have offspring and giving rise to another species, and they have crossing between different species, which create new combinations of variations, all of which are things that were present already in the original pair that were on the ark. So then he's saying, well, look, one of the generations lived 400 and some years after the flood. And so in that time period, the process of restoring biodiversity must have occurred before 440 years had transcribed following the flood. All right. And he kind of believes this also he believes this partly because of what he thinks he sees in the fossil record. And as we said before, the fact that some very specialized species are mentioned fairly early on in the Bible. So most of this diversification had to happen really fast. Now we're down to the sentence that is the whole reason I'm doing this talk. Biologists still do not know where or how the variety was hidden, nor do they know how that variety was revealed. Okay, so all right. This is what's necessary. Well, we can't squeeze all the species onto the ark. We know that God created kinds, and we're going to start now calling kinds a large group of species that are similar to one another and shared a common ancestor. That common ancestor, we're going to say, is the thing that God created. And God created that thing with a huge amount of diversity that was hidden inside. Now, this isn't just Kurt Wise saying this. There are other creationists that say that as well, but almost all creationists believe that somehow the ability for doing all these things to make different species had to have been in that original pair. It couldn't have been something that evolved, right? It couldn't have been a new piece of information that was generated after creation. So if we have 1,000 species where there used to only be one, and somehow, like, domesticated dogs all can come from wolves, and they have all these different characteristics which just seem to appear, but we know we're in the wolves. We can say, like Kurt Wise is saying, we can say that we know what's happened here. There's hidden variation, and the hidden variation is being expressed. But what we can't say is how it happened. Biologists still don't know where or how the variety was hidden. And we don't even know how that variety was revealed, although he is giving some hints, and other creationists would say epigenetics, and they'll say continuous environmental tracking. That's what ICR would say. They have these various theories. But I think it's really fascinating that Kurt Wise is essentially saying we don't, like, okay, we're still looking, right? There's that variation, but we don't know where it's hidden because, let's face it, we've sequenced the whole genome of lots of organisms. And if he's right that there's hidden variation, I would think that variation should be in the DNA, but I guess creationists could always say maybe there's other molecules that we haven't found out are actually molecules that store information and somehow are carrying code or carrying this hidden variation. And maybe that hidden variation can be turned on someday in some way that we don't understand yet. We've just completely missed that boat. All right, biologists today haven't seen that, but we have sequenced entire genomes, and so intriguingly, and I think Todd Wood is not. I don't think he's directly said this, but in a way, this is similar to some of Todd Wood's ideas of. It's the idea that there's going to be potential future changes in the environment. And so organisms will still need to continue to adapt, right? Today's environment is different than before the flood or even soon after the flood. And so organisms have to adapt, and where do adaptations come from? Apparently this hidden variation, this hidden pool of information that they can draw upon and say, like, okay, now we can do this. God gave us this variant for this particular time. Which means a young Earth creationist prediction is that we should be able to look in the genome or look and find, oh, here's this piece of code which isn't apparently being used right now, but it has a future application. Maybe you could even find that code and say, I can see this makes a certain protein and you're not using it now, but maybe you'll need to use it later. I don't know about any such hidden codes myself, but I suppose that is a prediction that young Earth creationists could make, that there must be additional codes and variants that we have yet to used. Now, the problem I have with, I see a big conflict within young Earth creationists over this idea, because many young Earth creationists make a big deal about genetic entropy. They say that ever since Adam's fall, the DNA code has not been able to copy itself faithfully, right? It makes errors. There's mutations that happen. And most of those mutations have negative fitness, or they're at best neutral. And then some of those creationists even say even the neutral ones are bad, even though that isn't the meaning of neutral. And what they'll argue is that basically all species are wearing down. Human beings can't last tens of thousands of years into the future because we're building up mutations in our population. And those mutations eventually will basically destroy us, right? And they're destroying all other species. And so species can't get rid of the mutations fast enough. They're going to build up. And eventually what they're doing is they're breaking genes, right? They're breaking down information. They're adding in bad information. And so my question has always been, and I've never gotten an answer for this when I ask this, if there are hidden codes that have never been used before and the organism doesn't need them, and so therefore they have no way to maintain those codes, at least through natural selection, because if any mutation happens to one of those codes, but you're not using the code, then it doesn't affect you, right? And so it's like, I'm still alive. I can still have offspring, in which case you share that broken version of code to the next generation. So if all these different hidden codes were around, right, hidden information, hidden diversity, were there in the original creation, and then you had 1,500 years before the flood, and you had all these mutations occurring in the genome, what was to prevent many of those hidden variants from disappearing, from getting broken, right? And so they can't simply wait 5,000 years until it's like, 5,000 years from now. For some organisms, that might be 50,000 generations from now. You're going to need this particular code that you've never used before, ever. So here's this piece of code that's 5,000 base pairs long, and it codes for some protein that you're going to need to resist, to make you more resistant to drought or something. And you're never going to use that particular code. And then suddenly you're going to use it 5,000 generations from now, or 50,000 generations from now. According to genetic entropy, that code's already going to be so broken by the time you get there, you won't be able to use it. So then you're going to have to employ some kind of miraculous intervention. You're going to have to say that God is protecting these codes, but at the same time he's protecting all these hidden codes for future generations, he's allowing the current code to go corrupt, right? Yeah. You see my confusion? It's kind of mind-boggling when you start to actually sit and think about the details of how all this would happen. Maybe Kurt Wise is right to just say, we don't know, right? Biologists don't know where this variation is, like what form it is in. They don't know how it's hidden there, right? And we don't even know how it's really revealed. Like, how does an organism know, like, today's the day when I'm going to need this new piece of code I've never used in all my previous generations? Now, this might fit with ICR's continual environmental tracking, where they kind of think that individuals are wandering around, and when they walk into a new environment and they experience drought where they haven't experienced drought before, that they turn on genes that they had never used before and start to express them, and they adapt to that environment, right? They're tracking the environment and they are changing. And then they somehow transfer that information to the next generation. So when they have children or they have offspring, those offspring will also now start using those same genes because they're living in that environment as well. The last sentence here. However, evidence for the hidden seems fairly strong. Okay, so he's saying, look, we don't know where this hidden stuff is, and we don't know how it's revealed, but there's a lot of evidence there's stuff that's hidden. And I think this is just an outcome of which he has to accept this, because he acknowledges that there's a heck of a lot of variation, right? There's a heck of a lot of species that have come from just a few species that were around at the time of the flood. And so therefore, there has to be hidden variation. He's just going to say that is an inference that is made and has to be true. Because ultimately, right, the Bible is true, or his interpretation of the Bible must be true. The world is young. There was a global flood. And so now we have to find a way to explain all this variation. So he says, it seems really strong. What's the evidence now that there is hidden variation, even if we don't understand how it comes out and how it came to be, or where it's hidden? The rapid increase in land animal diversity between the flood and the present suggests land animals possess a huge amount of hidden variety and a process of rapidly revealing it. So because I believe there was a flood, because I believe there was limited numbers of individuals after the flood, and today there are hundreds of species that come from those limited number of individuals, therefore there must be hidden variety, and there must be a process of rapidly revealing it. There it is. That has to be true. The rapid and extensive development of thousands of artificial breeds of plants and animals suggests that many different animals possess a huge amount of hidden variety. So he's going back to this thing with the artificial breeding. Now, I do want to say further about artificial breeding. All right, artificial breeding can tease out what it essentially does is it says wolves are a population that is well adapted to their environment. They have a lot of variation. It's just that they're not dramatic variants in terms of like visually what they look like. But if you were to look at their genomes, they're far more diverse than all the domesticated dogs. Domesticated dogs are not diverse genetically. So we have essentially taken the wolf's genetic variation and we've taken little tiny subsets of it and created these highly diverse appearing organisms. But if you look at their insides and you look at their genetics, they're very, very similar to one another. The rapid and extensive development of thousands of artificial breeds of plants and animals suggest many different organisms possess a huge amount of hidden variety. So again, I said this before, this is a very attractive argument because it's anyone who's not a biologist can look and say like, wow, that wolf, you took wolves and you made all these different domesticated dogs out of it. Couldn't you just take any other species and then make lots and lots of other species from that? Well, the thing is, in some ways, yes, you could. Horses have been turned into many different breeds of horses. And we could probably take many other species of this world and tease out different particular variants from those species and then make sure that they don't breed with other individuals that have other variants, and eventually we'll create sort of what you call, there's sort of different sets of pools of genetic variants that we call different breeds. They would still probably be compatible with each other and they'd still be considered one species. And they wouldn't have the type of genetic distance between them that we see between, say, different species of like a fox and a wolf, or even a wolf and a coyote are so much more different genetically from each other than a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are. Even though you might look at a Chihuahua and a Great Dane and think, oh, they're so different from one another. But their overall genetics is very, very similar to one another. And even their behaviors and other things are going to be more similar to each other than a wolf and a coyote are. But the larger point is that natural selection, that's artificial selection. Artificial selection can work very rapidly to separate individual things from gene pools because we can say, I specifically want that characteristic and I don't care about the other thousands of genes. But that's not what happens in the environment. In the environment, the entire organism is being selected for their overall fitness. Not, I like that character. The environment never selects for a single characteristic. It has to consider the entirety of the organism and all of its alleles together. And hence, the environment is never going to take a wolf and turn it into 50 different breeds of very different looking things that have been selected for just a few individual traits. Because those few individual traits aren't adapted to any environment, well, except for one, our homes and our eyes, right? What we want in those characteristics. But what we want is not necessarily to the benefit of the organism itself. So natural selection doesn't work at that speed. Natural selection does not work at the pace of artificial selection. You can think of artificial selection as a form of natural selection in which we can vastly speed up the process of creating variants. But in the real world, that form of selection is going to take tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of generations. And so that's partly why maybe Kurt Wise is saying we don't really know how this happened. We don't know what the process is. Well, he could have very well said, look, natural selection is able to, take the variation that's already hidden and then select for Well, no, if it's hidden, you can't select for it, right? And there's one of the problems. If a variant is hidden and not expressed, natural selection can't see any difference between that and another organism that doesn't have that variant. So it has to be expressed. So what he's looking for and wondering, how does God express these hidden variants? How do they suddenly start to become active? And we don't know the mechanism for that yet, right? So there's something that creationists still need to find in his estimation, but he thinks it must exist, right? That process has to exist. Since it's rather easy to lose the ability to hybridize, interspecific hybridization among a majority of species in families of all types of organisms suggest that the large amount of speciation has occurred very recently within many families of organisms. Yeah, okay. He's making an argument that, first of all, he's making a statement, since it's easy to lose the ability to hybridize. That's not a universal truism. I mean, I think that there are species that, horses and zebras, they can still hybridize. Right? Even though they might be, a million years since they've actually shared a common ancestor. Interspecific hybridization is very common in plants, among plants that are very distinct from each other, and everyone would agree are different species, but they're still able to hybridize. Now, it's true, there are some times where you have very similar organisms and they have a mutation, and then one of them becomes incompatible with the other, and so therefore unable to hybridize, and we would call those different species. And so he's saying that because there are many species in families, and it's easy for them to become species because they lose their ability to hybridize or cross with other members of what was the same species. Therefore, this must happen really fast, right? It must happen recently. So this is somehow evidence that new species could have been forming very quickly recently over time. I don't think that is at all a clear case and clear evidence. The occasional appearance of a modern organism of a complex trait known in fossil forms, called a genetic throwback, suggests hidden variety in that organism. Right now, here's where he pulls out one of his most interesting examples, and why I call Kurt Wise really thinks outside the box. He's not afraid to sort of ruffle some feathers within creationism. An example would be the occasional birth of a three-toed horse, reflective of fossil horses having three toes. All right, so here's his, the evidence that, hey, sometimes there's a three-toed horse instead of a single-toed horse. And then he says, look, mutation should have destroyed the unused genes in thousands or tens of thousands of years. Oh, he actually just made the point that I made earlier. Unused genes should have been destroyed by mutations. Right? The reason genes that are used aren't destroyed by mutations, because if there's a really bad mutation in a gene you're using, then that organism will die and they won't have any offspring. So that doesn't get passed down to future generations. So only genes that don't have those mutations survive to the next generation. And so that's one of the things that keeps the genes that are necessary going, right? All right, because any ones that are broken get lost. So his argument here is, how could you have the revival of an ancient trait if it was long, if it was millions of years ago, that would have been destroyed by mutations and therefore couldn't happen again. One of the things he's missing here as I'll say a non-biologist, is these aren't always mutations like, oh, this A changed to a T or this gene was corrupted. It's about developmental pathways. And if you have a mutation in a developmental pathway that then fuses the bones versus not fuses the bones, well, then you can revert back to a more primitive state of development, which might have been a three-toed horse instead of a single-toed horse. And that's a that's a change in a developmental pathway versus a change in a specific gene. I know that wasn't terribly clear, but it's not worth going over that point again. Complex traits in fossil form, a genetic throwback. I wouldn't consider a three-toed horse to be more complex than a single-toed horse. I actually think a single-toed horse is an advancement on the three-toed horse. But since mutations should destroy unused genes in thousands or tens of thousands of years, genetic throwbacks also suggest the modern species probably arose from fossil forms within a few thousand or tens of thousands of years. So you say, right, so anytime we see this type of thing happen, it must be evidence of recent formation. And then we get to the other big example he has, vestigial organisms, which is really kind of similar. It's saying you have a leftover organism, your organ you're not using anymore, something you used in the past, but as you transition to adapting to a new environment, you're no longer using. Although it is difficult to demonstrate partially vestigial organs ever had greater function in the past, right? Then those with no function at all in the present, fully vestigial organs, were most probably derived from organs with functions in the past. All that's to say, you look at something that doesn't appear to have function today or has little function today, and we can surmise that it had more function in the past. And that's hard to prove, but it's not an unreasonable hypothesis, right? That something, that an organ in the past, some gene even in the past had greater function. And now it simply has lost that function or is losing its function because of what it's now adapted to do in its present environment. And he would say that that is also evidence of rapid change. Those things are changing. An example would be hip and leg bones in fetal whales that disappear before birth. And again, since mutations should destroy unused genes in tens of thousands of years, fully vestigial organs that correspond to functional organs in fossil forms suggest that modern species probably arose from the fossil forms within a few last thousands or tens of thousands of years. All right, long sentence. Yeah, but he's pointing to there could have been, why do fetal whales have hip and leg bones? Right? He has said elsewhere that it's possible that the original whales actually were walking organisms that walked off of the ark and then adapted to living in the sea. And that part of that adaptation was losing their ability to make legs, right? And then turning on hidden variation. You see, the hidden variation thing is like the get out of jail free card, because anytime you need to explain, like, why do whales have all these features of land animals if they didn't live on land before? Oh, well, they did live on land before. Well, then how did they become so different in the water? Well, God gave them this hidden variation to be able to live in the ocean, even though they originally were created to live on land. And that was hidden variation that then when they had the opportunity to move into the ocean, somehow the hidden variation was turned on and they adapted to that. Now, what did they have to do with the other variation they had, the other information they had for making legs? They eventually lose some of that. But it's still like, you can still see that information is there because they still make hips and leg bones as fetal whales. And then they reabsorb that. But that's evidence of their past. And then he's throwing in this thing like, well, it must have been the recent past because even the genes for making hip and leg bones should have been, the developmental process should have been destroyed by long periods of time. But I think this is a really fascinating example of where you can simply throw out hidden variation, right? Oh, how do you explain that? Oh, hidden variation. Well, how did that get expressed? Well, we don't know yet. Right? We don't even know we don't know where the hidden variation is, and neither do we know how it's actually turned on in the future. But that explains all the variation that we have today and how fast it could have happened. Last point. Oh, no, second to last. The fossil species of a number of land mammal families are arranged in stratomorphic series. That is a steady succession or trajectory of different morphologies in corresponding steady succession of strata, rock layers. He's saying that as you go up different rock layers, you find fossil A and B and C and D, and this might be three-toed horse, a two-toed horse, and then a one-toed horse. And he's saying that they've evolved or changed or expressed new hidden variation as they went to adapt to new environments, right? The famous horse series. The next evidence. Remember, these were all evidences in his mind that there is hidden variation, and the hidden variation must be able to be expressed very quickly over time in order to explain how you get thousands of species from just one within just a few hundred years. Evidence indicates that new species have arisen in the past are also consistent with intrabarometric diversification. That means within a kind diversification. Also includes these things. In the case of many species on Earth, the most similar species to it has an adjacent geographical range. All right, where you find one species, sometimes the most similar species to that is in a geographical range right next door. All right, up the side of the mountain at a little higher elevation is a different species. It's close by. It's not like here's a species and then its closest relative is somewhere on the other side of the Earth and there's a completely different species living next to you. All right, that's a pattern, and he's right. That's a fairly consistent pattern that's observed. In the case of many island species, the most similar species to them are found on the nearest mainland. Go to the Galapagos Islands. There's a lot of unique species found only on the Galapagos Islands. Where do you find the most similar species to those species? Well, in South America, right? They're going to be nearest on the nearest landmass to that particular island. And the conventional explanation for that is that individuals migrated to the island when the islands formed. And then on the new island, they experienced new conditions, new and different conditions. And under those different conditions, natural selection selected for different characteristics, eventually adapting those organisms to that new environment and therefore gradually becoming new species. I don't think Kurt Wise's explanation would be much different. He would just say that he would not believe that new variants would be created, all right, fundamentally new characteristics for those organisms through mutations. So mutations create new characteristics, new variants, new programs that are then selected for by natural selection to create these new species, which now have some fundamental differences between the species that are back on the mainland. He would say that the individuals that arrived on the islands had hidden variation that was part of the species that it came from, which originally came from the ark and had all that variation in it. And now on the new island, some of those new hidden variations are expressed. Now, he might say then that after they're expressed, like, oh, it's drier here, right? So I'll express some things that help me adapt to this drier environment. And then natural selection is the process which then says, great, those particular variants are the ones that work here. Those ones will reproduce and have offspring and therefore continue the process of using those particular new variants that previously were hidden. Let's move on to the last point. A ring species, a circuit arrangement of populations around an uninhabitable region where all but a pair of neighbor populations can interbreed successfully, suggests the following historical scenario. So now he's going to lay out a scenario here. A species migrating to the border of an uninhabitable region at the point opposite the current location of the non-interbreeding neighbor populations. Okay, so here we go. Down here, here we have an original population. So, Noah's Ark is over here. And they migrate to North America and they set up shop in one particular location. And there's a growing population there, right? The species splits into two separate lineages living side by side, all right? Some of these individuals migrate down here as they expand the population. So maybe this is some huge lake, right? They're going around Lake Superior, one of the Great Lakes. And it takes many generations. Let's say these are plants, all right? And as I can find my cursor here. As the plants continue to move, right? Each season they might move a little bit farther. Some seeds get propagated a little bit farther. And these ones also propagate around the other side of the island, or the other side of this lake. Each lineage spread along one side of the uninhabitable region, changing as it went. Okay, now he's right. As they experience different, they're potentially going to experience different environments on both sides of this lake, right? And even as they move around the lake, they might experience different environments. There's new insects, right? There's new herbivores in different places that might munch on them in different ways. So those are challenges that the environment gives them. And when the environment challenges you, you need to change or you're going to go extinct potentially. So you adapt to those new environments. Now, as we were just talking about, what is that adaptation? In the traditional sense, all right, or the conventional way of thinking about this, as the population copies itself over and over and over again, it creates new combinations of alleles, variants, but it also has mutations, which create brand new variants that natural selection can then decide, is that a bad variant? Okay, you don't survive. Is that a good variant? Well, then you're more fit for this environment, and therefore you're going to have offspring and carry on that tradition of having that particular new variant. And so as they move along, they're going to continue to change as they do so, picking up new variants along the way through mutations. Kurt Wise's version, I think, would be this original population had a huge amount of variation in it. And then as they move on either side of the obstruction and they experience new environments, yes, natural selection happens on the variants that are already visible. But then there's also potential hidden variation that becomes expressed, and then natural selection can decide, yes, that hidden variation is great for the new environment. Or if you're ICR, you'd say that they're tracking the environment and intentionally turning on programs that they need that have been stored away since the original creation. All right, well, what happens when the two lineages meet again on the other side of this uninhabitable region? So they get all the way around the lake, and they find a way to, like, the two, there's individual seeds that get into the same area. They grow up and then they try to mate with each other. What happens? They're incompatible with each other. This is what we find in ring species. The species can exist from there's still the original population, and then there's all these other populations, and then there's these other populations on the other side of the lake. In other words, this species is all the way around the lake. And if you take individuals from here, this is a mess. If you take individuals from here and cross them here, it's like, we're fine, we can cross. If you take them from here, they can cross from there. And these can cross with these, 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 right? And these are fertile, 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 and these are fertile. And even this one might be fertile with this one, and this one might be fertile with this one. But guess what? These two are not fertile with each other, suggesting they're different species. Well, that's called a ring species because, in fact, this population is connected to this population all the way around the lake. And this one could go all the way around and be fertile all the way backwards through a succession of crosses. But when the descendants meet each other, we could say the two extremes of the population, the two most different members of the population of the species meet, they're incompatible with each other, suggesting they're a species. Well, this is where defining a species gets really hard, right? Because there's no obvious distinction as to what is a species and what isn't in this case. But it does suggest that this is the beginning of a new species being formed here. Now, he's going to argue, hey, this could happen fairly quickly, right? You have Central Valley in California. You've got mountains in Hawaii where they have to go around the mountain, and when they meet on the other side, they're different species. He thinks that that might happen in just a few hundred years. I think in reality, the natural selection process and migration and all that is really a multi-thousand, tens of thousands of year type of process, which eventually results in enough generations having passed, enough new mutations occurring, enough natural selection happening that you eventually create incompatible offspring that look like they're different species at the end of this process. Okay, so we're right back to what I thought was the central statement in this paper. Biologists still don't know where or how the variety was hidden. where is the variety? Where is this hidden variation? Where is it hiding in the genome? Is it right in front of our faces? Have we actually sequenced the genome? We have the code and it's staring us in the face, but we don't know how to read it. We don't know how it's used or will be used in the future. Or is it hidden somewhere else? Is it hidden in proteins? Is it hidden in RNA? Is it hidden in the water? Is it, or is it not something material? And how was it hidden, right? How did God do that? I mean, I think Kurt Wise is going to say we're not going to know that in this present life. But where it is certainly something that science should be able to explore. And then how is that variety revealed? Once again, you could say natural selection, but if it's hidden, you can't select something that's hidden. Natural selection, the environment can't look at 4 individuals and say, you've got this hidden variant that would be really useful in the future. I'm going to select you to have offspring and reproduce and pass on that hidden variation. And these other 2 don't have that particular variant, that hidden variant. So I'm not going to select you. How does nature know that? All right. Now, he could espouse a full sovereignty view of creation in which God is in control of everything that happens and just say it's all predestined and that God is doing all the choosing of every single interaction between every organism, in which case he's assuring that all this hidden variation is passed forward through time. And then God is expressing it at the very right moment in time under the right conditions. But in that, and I'm fine with that particular explanation, but that does pretty much remove it from, let's talk about how we might be able to explore that with our means of understanding the natural world, because that actually wouldn't be a natural explanation. And so that would remove all of creation science from the science aspect at all, which I think Kurt Wise is very interested in using science to try to explain how this would happen. So he's looking for a natural mechanism. Even if that natural mechanism is something that originally is authored by God, he would still say we should be able to explain it in a natural way by providential mechanisms. Yeah, okay, we spent a lot longer on that than I thought. I really should know better. I always take a lot longer than I think I'm going to take on anything that I start to talk about. But I don't know. I found this article to be kind of, it's simple, but Kurt Wise has a way of kind of just getting right to the nub of the question, right? And then simply exploring, like, what are the ramifications of, because this is what this is. What are the ramifications of a thesis which says that this is the way God created the world. This is when he created the world. There was this global flood. And I'm inferring from the fossil record and from the text that there was only 2 animals that survived this global flood. And then acknowledging the real world around you, like real observations, there are a lot of species. He's saying that's a problem, right? That's a problem that creationists have to address. And here's how I go about thinking about that. I think the way he lays that out is very clear in terms of his presuppositions and what he thinks is the way forward. I think it's a completely unreasonable scientific hypothesis, which is not substantiated by the data. And I think that his examples are very simple. And if we delved into, and we already spent way too much time, but if we delved into them a lot deeper, we'd find a lot of contradictory information from what he is trying to express. All right. I think we gotta call it quits. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, we'll be back with something later. Probably This Week in Creationism. I'm due for one. So probably This Week in Creationism coming up next. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.